Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Fight for Liberty show. Today, we have a really awesome show set up for you guys. So I'm just going to skip all the dilly-dallying and get right into it. We have Rabbi Litvin and Dave Smith here to discuss some very controversial topics that have been going on in the liberty movement lately. So like I said, we're just gonna jump right into it here. How's it going, guys?
Very good. Thank you, Rabbi Litvin, and thank you, David, for hosting us.
Thank God. Happy to be here.
All right. So I feel like everybody that's watching this knows what we're talking about here. There was a very controversial tweet that went out from the Kentucky LP official Twitter account, and a lot of people have very differing views on whether or not it should have been sent in general and how the reaction should have been handled and what it actually stood for and what it means. So we're going to have an open, good faith dialogue about this. This is not a debate. It's not, we're not coming in here with our preconceived ideas, or at least I'm not. And I'm excited to hear your guys' opinions and actually delve into this.
Sure. Well, who would you like me to start, or would the rabbi like to go first?
Well, I guess let's start out by just kind of getting your guys' original interpretation of the tweet, like how you guys first reacted to it. And let's start out with the rabbi.
So sure, the tweet was supposedly about, the focus was supposed to be, which ended up not being the focus, the proposed vaccine passports, which had been suggested. The idea, when the tweet came out, no one really had any idea what the idea was going to be. Government officials have backtracked on exactly what it's going to look like. So they were tweeting with very little knowledge of what this idea was, just a name. And the Libertarian Party of Kentucky chose to make a comparison to the badges that the Nazis forced Jews to wear on pain of death during the Holocaust, which those badges have a long history of oppression and segregating Jews from others. There were multiple issues with this comparison that we can get into over the long conversation, but for a lot of Jews, the basic issue was that they felt engaged in Holocaust minimalization. So the idea that, number one, whether or not your views on this vaccine are, and there are, of course, a myriad of views on it, taking it or not taking it, which results in getting the passport or not getting the passport, does remain a choice. It's a choice that affects your health. It's a choice that affects your liberty, certainly, but it does affect the choice. The Nazi government held that anyone who had a Jewish grandparent, which at that time, 3 out of 4 of those people, no one in the Jewish world considered Jewish. Only the Nazis considered them Jewish, was a Jew. So regardless of what choices they made, regardless of what their point of view was, they were sectioned off. And second of all, as this idea is just being proposed, and again, when they wrote this, they were completely guessing to expect what it's going to be, how it's going to be applied, etc., to apply it to a situation where we know how it was used. It was used to separate with the plan to exterminate the Jews of Europe. Long before the badges were introduced, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf. He was already speaking about plans to exterminate the Jews of Europe. So a star that was used with the plan of the wholesale slaughter of 6 million people, and actually more people, they only succeeded in killing 6 million people, is both ahistorical, the comparison doesn't hold up, and amoral to a lot of people. What's more troubling is both the Libertarian Party of Kentucky and a lot of the people defending the tweet have a long history of engaging in either straight up Holocaust denial or Holocaust minimalization, etc. So earlier that day, for example, the Libertarian Party of Kentucky tweeted, then took down a post about who controls America with a quote from Mayor Ansel Rothschild. Mayor Ansel Rothschild died hundreds of years ago. The quote was fake. And any research would have told them that generally when someone uses Rothschild quotes without researching them, it's a sign that they have certain views. Rothschild is commonly used in anti-Semitic conspiracies, the idea that the Rothschilds were in the world, etc. Last year, actually almost exactly a year ago, the LP in Kentucky put out a torrent of tweets comparing various aspects at the beginning of the shutdown to the Holocaust, including voting on a spending bill, which had nothing to do with COVID, mask mandates, and the like. And they were reached out to by the Jewish community, and their views were expressed. So there's certainly an insensitivity to writing it that way. And as a party that is seeking to make an impact in Kentucky specifically, and has had more success in the last few years than they've had in a long time before that, I think it's counterproductive to the party. I think it's counterproductive to the point they want to make, because while the Libertarian Party Twitter account celebrated the fact that the tweet went viral, it didn't lead to an open discussion on the issue. It merely led to an open discussion on Holocaust revisionism. Mm-hmm. And I think it does more to offend people than it does to advance either their cause or the topic they were discussing.
Yeah. So the one thing that I'll definitely agree on is that the conversation was nowhere near what it should have been or what it was intended to be by any of the good actors in the conversation. Yeah, you're completely right. We weren't talking about a vaccine passport or any threats to our liberties in real time right now. It turned into a 3-day conversation about the Holocaust instead, which really wasn't necessarily the point of.
And I would note that Justin Amash wrote a very similar tweet,
mm-hmm.
but thinking it out, he chose to use the word dystopian rather than the word than a reference to the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
You could certainly call the Holocaust dystopian, but by opening it up and not referencing a particular moment in history, not drawing all these comparisons, rather using a more open term, his tweet sparked a much more open conversation on the issue he was bringing up, rather than what this sparked.
Sure. So, Dave, what was your original kind of reaction?
Well, just to very quickly, because this is the first time me and Rabbi Litvin are meeting each other. So just to kind of disclaim my biases coming into this whole situation, I'll just quickly say that I am a radical libertarian who passionately believes in human liberty and absolutely despises the COVID regime that's been installed over the last year. And I think it's a truly dangerous, terrifying place that our country is in, and the amount of basic liberties that have been taken away from the American people is troubling, to say the least. I'm also a Jew, and my grandfather was a survivor of Nazi Germany, the only member of my family to survive. He escaped Nazi Germany in 1938. Everybody else died at the hands of the Nazis, and he just by luck or faith, I suppose, depending on how you look at it, was able to get out in 1938. And if he hadn't, I would not be here. And so I have a bias against the lockdowns and the COVID regime. I also have a bias against Nazis or taking the Holocaust lightly. I also am a stand-up comedian who's been hanging out in nightclubs for the last 15 years and has heard every wildly offensive joke in the world, and I have a pretty thick skin when it comes to that stuff. So just saying that in the background of all the the biases that I bring in to the discussion. So I was very appalled and concerned about the proposals, some of the proposals for this COVID vaccine, which has already gone into effect in New York City. And, I also, like Justin Amash, I went on a tweet storm about this and did not make any Holocaust comparisons. I actually compared it at one point to the Chinese social credit system because that just seemed like a more reasonable comparison to me. That was just the one that jumped out to my mind. Also because China has already implemented a COVID vaccine passport themselves. So I was I don't know that I completely agree that this completely distracted from the conversation. I have seen more of a conversation, certainly in the libertarian community, about these COVID vaccine passports than I have about just about any topic recently. So I think, and ultimately I would like to get back to that topic, which is part of the reason why I wanted to try to clear the air here. I agree with the rabbi that, look, anytime you make a comparison to the Holocaust, it's never going to be as bad as the Holocaust. I mean, or God help us, because that it's basically the worst thing that's ever happened, or up there, right up there. And so anything that you're comparing to the Holocaust is always going to fall a little bit short. I think it's absolutely fair to say that Holocaust comparisons are a little bit intellectually lazy, and they can be sloppy. That being said, I would disagree with the characterization that this tweet was minimizing the Holocaust. I think that to me the problem with using a term like that is that you're using a term that would more accurately apply to someone saying the Holocaust wasn't that big of a deal in some sense. That to me would be minimizing the Holocaust. I think the intent of this tweet was pretty clearly to maximize the danger of the COVID vaccine passports. Now, again, we can say that missed the mark. Of course, this is not the same thing as Jews being forced to wear a gold star in the lead up to the genocide of millions and millions of Jews. Again, though, there's kind of different sides to this, right? Like there is something that you could say that when people compare things to the Holocaust, which, let's get real, that's kind of just part of American culture. In large part because the Nazis were such an outrageously evil regime, in large part because the biggest war in the history of the world was fought against them. People use the term grammar Nazis. Seinfeld had an episode about the soup Nazi. This is something that is in our culture. And so, of course, whenever there's something that you want to call awful and authoritarian and totalitarian, it's one of the first things that comes to people's minds. And I think that there is actually an argument. Again, I'm not completely sold on this one way or the other, but perhaps you could make an argument that that's not the worst thing in the world, that we live with a very alive sense that we hold this regime up to be the worst regime ever. And if anything even starts to smell like it, we want to call that out and blast that because we never want to go down that path again. So I understand the argument that, okay, you don't want to compare everything to the Holocaust. I also understand the argument that it's good to never forget. It's good. Listen, Rabbi Litvin, I'm sure that you heard over the last year comparisons to the Holocaust, as I certainly did, when Jews were being rounded up, arrested in New York City, in New Jersey, for the crime of going to synagogue. There's been an awful lot of demonizing of communities that don't want to get vaccinated in these times. And that ends up, at least one of those communities, ends up being religious Jews. Now, of course, Governor Murphy in New Jersey arresting 20 Jews for going to synagogue is not it's not what the Nazis did, but I also do understand where there's this instinct to right away be like, hey, wait a minute. The state is arresting Jews for going to synagogue. We have a very strong allergy to anything going in that direction. So I don't necessarily think it's all bad, and I certainly don't think that the spirit of the Libertarian Party of Kentucky's tweet was anything anti-Semitic or downplaying the Holocaust. That's generally my take on it.
Yeah, I missed the tweet when it happened. The original shitstorm. I didn't see Seth Rogen's tweet on it, or I was not a part of that at all. I slept in that day, and then I was recording episodes all afternoon, and so I just missed all of it. I saw that my group chats were going off, and people complaining about that Twitter account. But honestly, I just assumed that it was in reference to one of the many other bad tweets that they had sent out in the last week that I had witnessed. They're not the greatest Twitter account. There's a reason they only have 4,000 followers. And, they were attacking a 15-year-old BLM supporter the other day. That got screenshotted and shared around some Facebook groups. And so I just assumed that it was a continuation of that stuff. When I finally actually caught on to what was going on and that they were being anti-Semitic, I was like, oh gosh, okay. And then I finally actually read the tweet at 11, actually it was after midnight that night. I was on Reed Coverdale's show, and Will's Fight actually read it out on the show. It was the first time I heard what was written. And I was just like, okay, this, again, I agree with both of you. Yeah, completely intellectually lazy, but far from there was no malice in that tweet from my original perspective. I think, again, I agree that it's intellectually lazy. I agree that downplaying the Holocaust is a bad thing. I agree that that people should stop using the word Nazi so much. But I don't think that it's with any kind of malice towards a race of people.
So I specifically said that the argument was ahistorical and amoral. I didn't say anti-Semitic, although in effect, when you minimize the Holocaust, you are being anti-Semitic. To several of Dave's points, number one, it is certainly not the same as straight up Holocaust denial, which many in the Libertarian Party have flirted with. I know you yourself have interviewed Nick Fuentes, who has engaged heavily in Holocaust denial. There are several others who are becoming prominent in the Libertarian movement who have also either flirted or outright engaged in Holocaust denial. It's not the same as that. But when you say that a measure that you have no idea what it's going to look like yet, like the vaccine passport or a mask mandate, is equal to what the Holocaust did, and when you compare two things, you're equating them. You're saying there's something similar among them without explaining that in any way. So there are many ways to use Holocaust denial, Holocaust comparisons. Generally, the proper way to do that is an intellectual argument over 2 pages. I think it is never a good idea to use a Holocaust comparison in 240 characters on Twitter. It's not only
that's a fair point.
It's not only intellectually lazy, and again, part of what made it offensive was the fact that it seems like a 15-year-old is running that account himself, that they have been offensive several times in the past. Also, a great deal of the backlash to those who shared perspectives from the vast majority of the Jewish community were just completely flooded with anti-Semitic jokes, anti-Semitic statements, threats, etc. So I personally was called capo, which are Jews who served in Nazi camps. I was told there'll be more pogroms against Jews, which is an organized government attack on Jews, and saw a vast amount of anti-Semitism, along with just a great deal of other immature tweets that looked like they were written by 15-year-olds. I don't think that there were many in the mainstream Jewish community who used Holocaust comparisons to describe Murphy and far more Cuomo and de Blasio's anti-Semitism over the last year. I think the majority of comparisons were to Soviet Russia rather than to the Holocaust, which is a much more apt comparison. As you said, with the comparison towards China is a much more apt comparison. Are there voices in the Jewish community that have compared it to the Holocaust? Sure, but I don't think the Jewish community is responsible for every member's voices, as I don't think any community is responsible for voices on the fringe. But in general, the mainstream Jewish community did not make that comparison in any form I've seen. And I would say that that there is a growing use of anti-Semitism in politics. There's a big difference between Seinfeld, who does have problematic issues in his show, and using Soup Nazi as a joke, and a party that wants to be taken seriously, that is part of a growing political movement, using it in a political argument. I think there's a big difference between those two things.
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So I agree that there's a big difference, but respectfully, I think that making a comparison is not the same as equating two things to each other. Making a comparison and it wasn't even a direct comparison. It was just referencing the yellow stars. Now, again, I'm not saying that this was perfectly accurate, but just for the sake of accuracy in this discussion, it's not as if the Kentucky LP said this policy is the same as the Holocaust. So I just want to be clear about that. And I agree that you can't, just as you said, just because there were some people in the Jewish community who may make comparisons to the Holocaust, well, you certainly can't, criticize all Jews. You and me are not responsible for what some other random person says, because we're all individuals. I would also say the same is true for the Libertarian movement and the Libertarian Party. And the idea that people within the party are flirting with Holocaust denial, I will just tell you that I have not seen any of that. I mean, I think that there are a couple very random examples of people who are not in the Libertarian Party, but that is not something that is present in the Libertarian Party at all. In fact, I've never come across a single member of the Libertarian Party who has engaged in Holocaust denial. So that's just at least been my experience as a member of the party for years and as a member of the Liberty Movement for about a little over a decade. Now.
So as a member of the Liberty Movement, you have enthusiastically interviewed Richard Spencer, Nick Fuentes, Hastem, what's his name?
I'm sorry?
I don't remember the name of the third guy I was going to say. The second name is the Christian Lord. I don't remember what his first name was.
Hotep.
There you go.
Yes.
Hotep. and others who have either openly or so those three have openly engaged in anti-Semitism. Two of them have openly engaged in Holocaust denial. So I don't think it's fair to say that there are not voices being extremely supported and platformed in the Libertarian Party, including members of the Libertarian Party, who do espouse Holocaust denial.
Well, okay,
I think it's a fact
but none
of
of the
the party
people you
today.
mentioned. Hold on, but none of the people you mentioned are members of the Libertarian Party, which is why I specifically said that. I wouldn't. I don't know if I'd say I enthusiastically interviewed them, or I forget what your other term there was. But yes, I have. I've had interviews with some people who certainly have hostilities toward Jewish people. I personally do not think that it is the worst thing for there to be a conversation between a Jewish person and people who have some anti-Semitic views. In fact, I think that you could make a very strong argument that it's more productive and better that maybe there are some communications there. I certainly myself have never agreed with any anti-Semitic views. I am a Jewish person. I love Jewish people. I love my family. I don't know. Shout out to Beth Elohim, Park Slope, Brooklyn. That's where I was bar mitzvahed. So again, I just think that we're kind of conflating a lot of different things here, and that I mean we can kind of take them one at a time if you'd like to. But I don't think, as I've said, I've never. I can't say it doesn't exist, but I've never heard of an LP member deny the Holocaust. I've also never had anyone deny the Holocaust to me or on my show, in which case I would have been quite happy to debate them on it. I believe it's, if not the most, right up there with the most well-documented genocide in human history. And so I don't, again, I think it's I don't think there's any argument there, but if someone were to want to argue that with me, I'd be more than happy to. Yeah, I mean, talking to people who have views, even some views that you really disagree with, I think not only is there not anything wrong with that, but I actually think it's probably our best hope. And if you look at anybody who's had the most success, you know, people like Daryl Davis, I believe is his name. Did I get that wrong? But people like who have had the most success in you know, dissuading people of some of their bad ideas are the ones who are willing to have conversations with them.
So I would say I've listened to Daryl Davis's conversations with white supremacists, and I listened to various libertarian radio hosts, including your interviews with white supremacists, and the mood is extremely different in what they confront, what they let slide, and what they agree with. So I don't know if the Daryl Davis comparison is exactly fair.
Well, I'm not suggesting that I am the same as him, but from my understanding of his arguments or his explanation, I did watch one of his like TED Talk videos, and he basically said that what he would do is befriend these people, have conversations with them, you know, treat them like people, treat them respectfully, and that over years. It was, you know, there was gradual progress that was made. So I don't know. I mean, no, I'm not saying I'm exactly the same as him. I'm certainly not. He's had a lot more success. I wish I had some hoods in my collection like he does. But I was just making the point that having conversations and being respectful with people, even people who might have some views that are abhorrent, I don't think that in itself is a bad thing.
Yeah, I definitely want to echo that a little bit, because I hear the names that you're bringing up, Rabbi, and to echo Dave, like none of them are actual members of the Libertarian Party. So to echo what you said about how, you know, every group has some fringe people, and you can't attack the larger group based off of a couple of people's takes. I think, you know, what you said about the Jewish people maybe making Holocaust comparisons during COVID, what you said about that, you need to then take and apply to the Libertarian Party, because it's the same thing. You're taking a couple of fringe people's bad takes on Twitter and saying that the Liberty Movement or the Libertarian Party is engaging in anti-Semitism or friendly to anti-Semitism, when as a whole, we are very much not friendly to any of that. And, you know, I'm part of the New York City party, where literally 2/3 of our membership is Jewish. We have to plan our entire schedule around that. We can't have meetings on Fridays or Saturdays because most of the people in the state party and the city party wouldn't be able to show up. So, you know, when I'm working in a party that literally has to move their schedule completely around the schedule of Sabbat and different holidays because we have such a large Jewish membership, to then get called anti-Semitic as a movement or as a party just doesn't make sense to me.
So I would say that hosting someone within days of them marching, chanting "Jews will not replace us," and not confronting them on them marching and saying "Jews will not replace us" seems to not have an issue with that. Hosting someone like Richard Spencer, who has called for violence against Jews, and not confronting him on that. Hosting someone like Nick Fuentes, who has said the Holocaust never happened at the ovens, and to say that his jokes about the ovens not happening are funny, etc. That seems to be a at least implicit respect for their point of view, and I don't think that is showed by most of the mainstream parties. Now, the mainstream parties today also use Holocaust comparisons far too often, and is just as offensive. I would note that someone from my community made a comment that I thought was inappropriate when responding to a different tweet many found offensive from the Libertarian Party north of New Hampshire, and I immediately called them out on it as well. I work to be so the only reason I knew about it to call her out on it was she tweeted the word Kentucky, and I anything Jewish in Kentucky on Twitter I see. So I mentioned that her comparison was equally inappropriate. Now, I do think there are many of those who are making the attacks right now who want to attack the argument being made or want to attack the Libertarian Party and wouldn't attack the same argument made by someone in either the Republican or Democrat Party, depending where they're coming from. But I also think that to reject that this is a view, or to say it's only a fringe view, when quite a few members of the party are not only agreeing with this, retweeting it, etc. So I don't know if you two would consider yourselves prominent members of the party or not, or prominent voices in the libertarian movement or not, but there certainly were prominent voices in the libertarian movement who are sharing this. And further, you have an official party account tweeting Rothschild quotes and Yellow Star references, and there's no condemnation from anyone that while I appreciate the argument, I disagree with the mode they use to make it. I think that shows an implicit agreement with the arguments they're making, which again, the arguments they're making, according to the vast majority of the Jewish community, would be defined as Holocaust minimalization, which is anti-Semitic.
So I'm curious where you're getting the no condemnation part from, because our chair condemned it, a bunch of people in the party condemned that tweet, to the point where that was most of my Twitter feed the day of, was people condemning this tweet. And I mean, yeah, I had plenty of people that I follow that were also supportive of the tweet itself, because we're having this conversation, because I think there's some middle ground on the tweet itself. People could misunderstand. I think a lot of people didn't understand what you're talking about, and I would have retweeted that without a second thought had I seen it before the conversation, just because I thought it was a hot take, catchy compare. Not everybody has.
So again, the reason it's a hot, catchy take is it's an emotional argument built on the back of 6 million Jews.
Right.
That's why it's a hot, catchy take.
And I agree with what you're saying there, and I agree that people, especially myself, as not a Jew, I don't always think through those thought processes. I'm sure there are a whole bunch of things that you could probably find in my Twitter feed that are offensive to some group of people, if not multiple groups of people, either out of ignorance or sometimes intent. But so I think that to compare people retweeting this tweet to being supportive of anti-Semitism as a whole, because like you said, it's that tweet you in the beginning of this episode said wasn't necessarily anti-Semitic. You said that it was
in intent.
Right. So I think the people sharing or retweeting it was probably also not anti-Semitic in intent. But the people condemning it, which was a lot of people, and including the most prominent member of the party, the chairman of the Libertarian Party, as well as a whole bunch of other state accounts, a whole bunch of other prominent people.
So
did
the
actually
silence I was
push
referring
back.
to was specifically within Kentucky. I do appreciate there were many national voices that condemned it. So I will adjust that. I wasn't talking about national voices at that point. I would say that many of the comments on the tweet, especially in response to other people, were blatantly anti-Semitic.
Well, okay. If I could just respond to like a few things, because again, I think there's a lot of things that are being thrown out here, especially, and they're very different issues. But the guests that I've had on my podcast in the past, just because you brought that up a couple of times, I will say this: my podcast, I didn't realize we were going to be discussing this, but I'm happy to, if you'd like to. I have had controversial guests on my podcasts from all different areas of the political spectrum. And if you look throughout my podcast, this is pretty much how I treat all of them. I show them respect. I joke around. I'm a comedian. I get into some of the issues. There is nobody who listens to my podcast and doesn't know exactly where I stand. I've done about a dozen episodes over the years, an hour and a half long episodes on the alt-right, on anti-Semitism, on the history. I've talked about the history of my family. I've talked about the history of the Jews. I mean, a lot of this stuff. It's very, very clear where I stand. The Mises Caucus, who you were critical of on Twitter, is named after Ludwig von Mises, who was a brilliant Jewish economist who also, by the way, fled from the Nazis. My intellectual heroes are disproportionately Jewish, and so you can pick out moments of some of the people I've had and say, you get this impression. I don't think anybody who is a regular listener of my show gets any impression other than what I actually believe in, which is that I'm passionately support human liberty. As far as the stuff that you're saying, I mean, if you're going to look, you said at one point that if we want to be taken seriously as a political party, you can't make these type of comparisons. The issue with that is that, as you acknowledged, all the serious political parties, the other two, engage in the same sort of behavior all the time. That's not to justify it when they do it, and I appreciate your consistency in calling it out across the board. But, I mean, just the other day, Joe Biden said that the voter ID restrictions in Georgia were worse than Jim Crow, which seems like an unfair comparison to me. It is interesting to me, though, that you're calling these things anti-Semitic. I suppose not in intent, but in effect. I believe is what you said. I mean, I think somebody could criticize you for minimizing anti-Semitism the same way you're being critical of minimizing the Holocaust. I mean, if you're going to say that anti-Semitism means somebody who hates Jewish people, but you're going to throw that term around when there are real people who hate Jews out there, but we're going to throw that term around about somebody who's clearly not saying anything even remotely close to I hate Jewish people. That's not what they're saying with the tweet. What they're saying is the Holocaust was horrible and oh my God, are we going down this path? Now, I understand this wasn't it wasn't a 10-page paper with an intellectual argument behind it. It's a tweet. That's the nature of Twitter. But I think you could just as accurately be criticized for minimizing anti-Semitism by throwing out the accusation over that tweet.
So I think the Jewish community as a whole has a right to define what anti-Semitism is, and they have. And I think that specifically, as David said a little earlier, that it wasn't a direct Holocaust comparison. It was a flippant joke about the Holocaust. So number one, especially if you're officially writing something as the voice of a party, making flippant jokes about the Holocaust is a bad idea. But minimizing the Holocaust as a whole, which very much is what this does, comparing a yellow star that was worn throughout parts of history, not just during the Holocaust, but specifically was adopted during the Holocaust to mark the people that they planned to kill, to a floated idea of a vaccine passport, is minimizing what the yellow star was. Doing it in a flippant way and doubling down on it in an extremely aggressive way only exacerbates the problem. So I don't think it's me saying that Holocaust minimization is anti-Semitism, is anti-Semitic in effect. And by the way, I didn't say it's never anti-Semitic in intent. I said in this case, I don't know if it was anti-Semitic in intent. I would say that having tweeted a blatantly anti-Semitic tweet about Rothschild hours earlier does bring into question the thought process of the person doing tweeting. But certainly in intent, which is minimizing the Holocaust, is anti-Semitic. It's not my view. It's the vast majority of the Jewish community's view. Well,
okay. I mean, I don't know if it's the vast majority. Like, I haven't seen polling data over the vast majority of the Jewish community, but I'm part of the Jewish community, as are you. And I think that's just an appeal to the majority. I mean, I think that anybody, myself, you, or anyone who's not a Jew can make an argument over what anti-Semitism is or isn't. And whether you're a Jew or not, or even if the majority of the Jewish people feel a certain way, that doesn't just inherently mean they're right because they feel that way. I'm curious. I mean, again, I don't think you really responded to my to my point that I made, considered minimizing as much as you're saying that this tweet